Twilight over meadow and water, the eve star shining above the hill, and Old Nog the heron crying kra-a-ark as his slow dark wings carried him down to the estuary. A whiteness drifting above the sere reeds of the riverside, for the owl had flown from under the middle arch of the stone bridge. Voles were at work, clearing their tunnels, scraping new shafts and galleries, biting the rootlets which hindered them. An otter, curled in the dry upper hollow of a fallen oak, heard them, and, uncurling, shook herself on 4 short legs. Through a woodpecker's hole above her she saw the star cluster of the hunting dogs as faint points of light. She was hungry. Since noon the otter had lain there, sometimes twitching in sleep. The white owl alighted on the upright branch of the tree, and the otter heard the scratch of its talons as they gripped the bark. The otter gave but a glance to the bird. She was using all her senses to find enemies. She stood rigid. The hair on her back was raised. Mingled with the flower odours, which were unpleasant to her, was the taint that had given her a sudden shock. The taint most dreaded by the otters who wandered and hunted and played in the country of the 2 rivers. The scent of Deadlock, the great pied hound with the belving tongue, leader of the pack whose kills were notched on many hunting poles. The otter had been hunted that morning. Deadlock had chopped at her pate, and his teeth had grooved a mark in her fur as she ran over a stony shallow. The pack had been whipped off when the master had seen that she was heavy with young, and she had swum away down the river and hidden in the hollow of the water-lapped trunk. The mist moved down with the river. Her heart slowed. She forgot quickly. She put her head and shoulders under water, holding her breath, and steadying herself by pressing her tail, which was thick and strong, and tapered from where her backbone ended, against the rough bark. She was listening and watching for fish. Swimming above the weeds of the pool, she followed the way of the trout, searching every big boulder. She found a fish under an ash-tree root, and as it tried to dart away over her head, she threw herself sideways and backwards and seized it in her teeth. By a bay in the bank, broken and beaten by the hooves of cattle going to drink, she ate her prey, holding it in her 4 paws and crunching with her head on one side. She was drinking a draught of water when a whistling cry came from under Canal Bridge. It had a thin, hard, musical quality, and carried far down the river. She answered gladly, for it was the call of the dog otter with whom she had mated nearly 9 weeks before. He had followed her down from the weir by the scent lying in her seals or footprints, left on many scours and on the otter path across the meadowland of the river's bend. He swam in the deep water, hidden except for his nose, which pushed a ream on the surface, placid in the windless night. He was kicking 4 webs together, having sighted a fish. The peel, or sea trout, had gone down, passing 3 inches off the snapped jaws. Where water clawed the stones at the tail of the pool, the peel leapt to save itself from the enemy, ever trudging and peering behind it. It fell on the shillets on its side and flapped once, then lay still, moving only its gills. Then the dog otter was standing by it, holding up his nose to sniff the air, when a thin, wavy, snarling cry rose out of the water. It was the bitch's yinny-yicka, or threat. She ran upon the fish, pulled it away from the dog, who was not hungry, and started to eat. The dog had caught and eaten a peel on his journey and was ready for sport and play, but the bitch didn't follow him into the river. She felt the stir of her young, snarled at the dog in sudden fear, and turned away from the water. The moon rose up 2 hours before dawn, and the shaken light on the waters gladdened her, for she was young, and, calling to the dog with a soft flute-like whistle, she swam to the high-arched bridge upriver, and hid among the sticks and branches posited by the flood on the bow of the stone cutwater. Here he found her, and they played for half an hour, turning on their backs with sideways sweeps of rudders, and never touching, although their noses at each swirling encounter were but a few inches apart. It was an old game they played, and it gave them delight and made them hungry. So they went hunting for frogs and eels in a ditch which drained the water meadows. The rising sun silvered the mist lying low and dense on the meadow, where cattle stood on unseen legs. Over the mist the white owl was flying on broad, soft wings. It wafted itself along, light as the mist. Throughout the daylight it stood among the bones and skulls of mice. At dimity it flew down the right bank of the river and perched on the same branch of the fallen oak and skirred to its mate, who roosted by day in a barn near the village. It flew away. It fluttered down upon many mice in the fields, but the bitch otter did not leave her holt. The instincts which had served her life so far were consumed in a strange and remote feeling that smouldered in her eyes. She lay on her side in pain and a little scared. When the moon gleamed out of the clouds in the east, pale and wasted as a bird in snow, the occasional whistles of the dog ceased. She didn't care, for now she needed no comfort. She listened for another cry, feeble and mewing, and whenever she heard it, she rounded her neck to caress with her tongue a head smaller than one of her own paws. All the next day and night and the day after, she lay curled for the warming of 3 blind cubs. And while the sunset was still over the hill, she slid into the water and roved along the left bank, looking in front and above her, now left, now right, now left again. A glint in the darkness. Her back looped as the hind legs were drawn under the full thrust of webs, and bubbles wriggled off her back, larger than oak apples. She was only a little slower than when she had last chased a trout. Her rudder, about 2/3 as long as her body and 2 inches thick at the base, gave her such power of swiftness in turning that she snatched the fish 2 feet above as it flashed over her head. She ate it ravenously, half standing in shallow water, yinnying at shadows as she clawed and swallowed. After 4 hasty laps, she went under again. She caught an eel, ate the lower part of it, and returned to the holt. But she was still hungry, and left them a second time, running up the bank to stand upright with the breeze drawing across her nostrils. The eldest and biggest of the litter was a dog cub, and when he drew his first breath he was less than 5 inches long, from his nose to where his wee tail joined his backbone. His fur was soft and grey as the buds of the willow before they open at Eastertide. He was called Tarka, which was the name given to otters many years ago by men dwelling in hut circles on the moor. It means little water wanderer, or wandering as water. This was the bitch's first litter, and she was overjoyed when Tarka's lids ungummed and his eyes peeped upon her, blue and wondering. He was then 11 days old. When his eyes had been opened a fortnight, Tarka knew so much that he could crawl as far as a yard from her, and stay away, although in her anxiety she mewed to him to return. She was afraid of the daylight by the opening of the holt, but Tarka had no fear. He went back to his mother and played the biting game with her, after which he slept. When he awoke again, he saw one of his sisters playing with something and immediately wanted it. The cub was patting it with one paw, holding her head sideways, but as it did not run, she patted it with the other paw, while holding her head to that side. Tarka was slowly crawling towards it, meaning to take it for himself, when he noticed that it was looking at him. The look frightened him as he hissed at it. When next he went towards it, the look in its eyes had changed, and he boldly touched it with his nose and shifted it with a paw. It looked at him no longer, for it was only the skull of a field vole, and light coming down a woodpecker's hole from above had put shadows into its empty eyes. Tarka moved it between his paws. Some of its teeth dropped out and rattled inside the hollow. The sound pleased him. He played with the skull. When he heard one of his sisters mewing in hunger, he hurried back to his mother. One evening, when the cubs were alone, Tarka was playing with his rattle when he heard for the first time the jets and rills on the stones which made the ancient song of the river. He wanted to get nearer to the sounds and crawled along a root. When he was halfway along it, he saw that there was nothing on either side of him. He was alone on the root. He tried to turn back, but the claws of one hind foot slipped, and there he clung, curved across the wood, unable to go up or down. He mewed to his mother, but she didn't come. His cries grew more and more plaintive as he became colder. The bitch had heard Tarka's cries, and fear had shocked her into the swiftest movements. She picked up her cub by the neck and carried him to the shore. She swam with her head held high and carefully, lest the water should touch him. Afterwards, lying on the warm couch, she forgot her fright and closed her eyes in the enjoyment of her young. The next night Tarka crept along the route again, and fell in the same way. He was crawling around when a strange-smelling animal leaned over him, wetting him with drops from its jowl. He tissed at it and tissed again when he heard the yinny-yicker of his mother and the snap of her teeth as the animal was driven away. Then something bit the back of his neck and lifted him up. With the cub dangling from her mouth, the bitch threatened the dog-otter, who had followed her in curiosity to the holt. The dog tried to look into the tree on the following night, but the bitch dragged him down by the rudder, as though she would drown him. The dog thought this was fun, and regrousted with her under and on the water all the way to Leaning Willow Island, where she left him, remembering Tarka. In mid-May, the buds of the fallen oak began to open hopefully, and to show their ruddy leaves. The cubs were 2 months old, and they'd learned to squeeze through the inner opening of the holt and run along the root in order to play on the grassy bank. One night, as they were playing rough and tumble round the base of an ash tree, they heard their mother's whistle. The bitch was waiting for them. She had brought an eel, which she bit into pieces, beginning near the tail, but leaving the head above the paired fins. Tarka swallowed little pieces of the fish and licked his small sister's head afterwards because it tasted nice. Then he licked his own paws. He was cleaning himself for the first time. After their mother's milk, the new food changed them almost at once. They grew swift and fierce. Their frolics on the bank often ceased at the cry of a night bird or the distant bark of a cattle dog in the village. They started whenever their mother started. They began to fear. One warm evening, when the river was low, the mother swam down to the holt and called the cubs into the water, and although they were ravening, she didn't climb up, but waited for them with a fish below the tree. Tarka watched her. He wanted the fish, but he dared not let go with his feet. The fish came no nearer, so he dropped down into the black, star-shivery water. He was clutched in a cold and terrible embrace, so that he could neither see nor breathe, and although he tried to walk, it smothered him, choked him, roared in his ears, and stifled every mew for help, until his mother swam under him, pressing pads and tail against her back. Tarka was carried to the stony margin of an islet, where the closed flowers of the water crow's foot were floating among their leaves. He spluttered and sneezed and shook water out of his eyes, and saw the stars above him, and felt his mother's tongue on his head. When he had eaten the fish, Tarka began to enjoy the strangeness. He was playing with the fish tail when he heard the whistle so often listened to from the holt. When he saw the animal with the wide, flat head and great bristling whiskers that had loomed over his head once before, Tarka tissed and snarled at it and ran for his mother. He snapped at the nose, sniffing at him. The dog turned on his back and tried to touch Tarka with his paws in play. Tarka watched him and wanted to roll as well, but he was awed by the stranger's size. When he went into the water the next night and tried to walk towards his mother, he floated. He was so pleased that he set out across the river by himself, finding that he could turn easily towards his mother by swinging his hind quarters and rudder. He turned and turned many times in his happiness. East towards Willow Island and the Water Song, west towards the Kingfisher's Nest and Peel Rock below Canal Bridge and the Otter Path crossing the Big Bend. North again, and then southwest, where the gales came from, up and down, backwards and forwards, sometimes swallowing water, at other times sniffing it up his nose, sneezing, spitting, coughing, but always swimming. He learned to hold his nose above the ream or ripple pushed in front of it. When they had been swimming about a fortnight, the bitch took her cubs to a pool below the bridge and walked with them across a shallow tail of water. While they were watching, the mother ran along the bank to the top of the pool and slid into the water. More often than usual, her head looked up as she swam from bank to bank, for she was not hunting, but driving the fish down to the cubs. Tarka became excited, and seeing a fish, he swam after it and went underwater to get it. In order to travel faster, he struck out with all four webs together, and lo, Tarka was swimming like an otter near a fish. It was the biggest fish he had ever seen, and although he kicked after it at a rate of nearly 200 kicks a minute, he lost it after a yard. He yickered in his anger, and Tarka was no longer swimming like an otter, but gasping and coughing on the surface, a poor little sick-feeling cub mewing for his mother. Later, in the holt, Tarka closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and settled to sleep on the youngest cub's neck. He looked up when his mother ran to the opening. The otter was listening to a sound like the high, thin twang of a mosquito. Hair bristled on her neck. From far away there came a deep, rolling sound and a screaming cheer. The otter instantly returned to her cubs and stood over them in a protective attitude, for she knew that hounds were hunting the water. The cries were growing louder. Tarka heard thuds in the wood all around him. The cubs crouched in the darkest corner. By their big feet, hounds pulled themselves out of the water, except the one who threw his deep tongue at the Holt opening. He was all black and white, with great flews, and the biggest stallion hound in the pack. He was black from nose to neck, except for the pallid nicks of old quarrel scars on his muzzle and head. No hound quarrelled with him now, for Deadlock was master of all. In his veins ran the blood of the Talbots, and one of his bloodhound ancestors had eaten man. Deadlock was the truest marking hound in the country of the two rivers. He held by his paws, and his teeth tore at the sodden tinderwood. He could thrust in only his head. While he was kicking the water for a foothold, the otter ran forward and bit him through the ear, piercing the earmark where the blue initial letters of his original pack were tattooed. Deadlock yarred through his bared teeth. 3 small mouths at the other end of the Holt opened and hissed in immense fright. Then Tarka heard a cry which he was to hear often in his wanderings, a cry which to many otters of the two rivers had meant the longest swimmings, the fastest land-looping, the quietest slipping from drain or Holt were unavailing. "Tally-ho!" The cry came from down the river, just above Leaning Willow Island, from the throat of an old man in a blue coat and white breeches, who had been leaning his bearded chin on his hands, clasping a ground-ash pole nearly as long and as old as himself. From his lookout place he had seen something moving down, like brown thongweed, just under the clear and shallow water. Off came the hat, grey as lichen, to be held while he cried again, "Tally-ho!" Here, across the shallow, a dozen men and women stood almost leg to leg in the water, stirring the stream with their iron-shod poles to stop the dog-otter passing down to the next pool. A dozen hounds were giving tongue between Canal Bridge and the stickle above Leaning Willow Island. A shaggy face looked into the Holt, and a voice cried just over Tarka's head, "Go on, leave it, Dewdrop! Go on, leave it!" Boots knocked on the trunk. Is, go on, leave it!" And Dewdrop left it, bitten in the nose. Unable to break the stickle, the dog-otter went back under the bridge. Baying became fainter. The notes of the coal tits in the ash tree were heard again. The sound slowed and ceased, except for the lone baying of a hound. They broke out again and slowed away into silence. But long afterwards the strange blowing noises made by their mother frightened the huddled cubs. By and by they fell into a deep sleep, torn with dreams wherein an immense black face showed its long fangs. Tarka slept with his small paws on the neck of his mother, and her paw held him there. She awoke when the wood owl had made a score of journeys with mice to the nestlings in the old eyrie of a trapped buzzard, when the badger had walked many miles from its earth in the oak wood. She was hungry. Leaving her cubs asleep, she crept out of the Holt. At the water edge she listened nearly a minute. Then she turned and climbed the bank, running into the meadow where cows snuffled at her as she stood on her hind legs. Then swiftly back to the brook by another way, through tall balsam plants to the water, where she climbed on a boulder and lay across it, her head near the stream. She clung by her rudder to the reverse side of the stone and whistled for the cubs. Tarka had been peering from the Holt, and at the first whistle he moved forward into the water, making hardly a ripple. He swam across the pool with his forelegs tucked under him, kicking with the hind legs only. The toes were spread at the thrust, so that 2 webs drove him forward with one kick. Behind him swam the cubs, the arrowy ripples pushed from their noses, breaking against each other. They followed Tarka across the floating crow's-foot flowers, and reached their mother, who lay so still. They spoke to her, nuzzling her with their heads and mewing their hunger. The otter caught small fish so quickly in the narrow water that Tarka was soon gorged, and the other cubs in their quick hunger were able to snatch a fish from him while he was rolling on his back in order to have the pleasure of clawing it over his head. At dimmet light they went down to the brook again, meeting a fox who was quietly lapping to quench his thirst made by swallowing the fur of so many mice. He looked at the otter looked at him. The fox went on lapping until the water was spoiled by their musky scent, when he went up the hill to sniff in his earth. The otter took her cubs up the brook and over a field. Away from water her movements were uneasy. Often she stopped in her low running to stare with raised head and working nostrils. A galvanized iron chicken coop in a field caused her to make a wide loop. The scent of man was there. A pair of boots left by a tramp in a hedge made Tarka tiss with fear, turn about and run away. The cubs were now as active and alert as their mother. At last they reached the ditch remembered by the otter. She leaned down to the brown scummed water, clinging to the bank by her rudder. Bullfrogs had been croaking a moment before she arrived there, but now they were silent and burrowing in the mud. With paw and nose she sought under the weed, nipping them and dropping them on the grass. The cubs seized them and turned away, yickering. And when she'd caught all she could find, the otter ran back to the cubs and began to flay the frogs, for their skins were tough. They left some of the frogs uneaten and travelled a mile up the brook, which became smaller and narrower, and at the end of the night it was less than a yard across. They reached a thread of water and followed it downwards until it was joined by another thread. The two made a stream which hastened under whitish banks of clay. The otter sought for fish, but finding none, climbed out of the channel by a slanting otter path and crossed the railway track near a tall dark chimney that rose out of buildings. It was a brick factory. An otter had travelled before them, and in a hollow behind birch trees about a quarter of a mile on they heard a whistle. And running towards the call, they came to a deep reed-fringed pond, on the clay side of which a grown dog-otter was playing with the wings of a drake. Tarka kept behind his mother, being frightened of the stranger. He had a split ear, done in a fight 2 years before. Mother and cubs went into the pond, leaving him rolling on the bank and tossing the wings with his paws. Mother and cubs roved about in the water for a while, and the dog joined them. The frogs and eels, having seen them, were in hiding, and so the bitch climbed out through the grey lichened whitethorn bushes and ran among rush clumps to the next pit. They hunted through 4 ponds before they had caught enough to be ready for romping. The 4th pond was larger than the others, and so deep that Tarka had not breath enough to follow the grown otters down in the gloomy water, although he tried many times. He knew they were playing, and mewed to them to come up. Sometimes a string of luminous bubbles shook up and past him, but that was all he saw of the fun. He could see above him, but all was obscure beneath, although he could sometimes hear them. The old dog-otter was happy because he had another otter to play with him. His wander years were past. He had killed salmon in the Severn, eaten pollock on the rocks of Portland Bill, and lampreys in the Exe. Now he dwelled among the reeds and rushes of the white clay pits. The pollen-holding anthus of the reed maces withered and dropped into the water, but still the bitch and cubs stayed on the land of ponds. Here Tarka tasted his first pheasant, caught by the bitch in the woods where game was preserved. It was a cock-bird, and only had 1 wing, the other having dropped off in the winter after a gunshot wound. The bird was a swift runner, and nearly pecked out the eye of the otter before it died. By day they slept in the reeds. From his couch of bitten and pressed-down hollow stems, Tarka watched the dragonflies which flew glittering over the water. Once a cuckoo was flying over with an egg in its beak when a sparrowhawk dashed at the bird and the egg dropped into the water. Splap! Tarka awakened, saw the egg, dived, brought it to the couch, and ate it before the shadow of a grass stalk had moved its own width on the bank. Tarka was rolling on his back in the beams of the sun one morning when he heard the distant note of the hunting horn, and soon after the tongues of hounds. The bitch listened, and when the baying became louder, she pressed through the reeds with the cubs and took to the bramble undergrowth beyond the north bank of the pond, where the bitch and cubs were safe, for although hounds drew down the brook, finding and carrying their line to a wood, the hunt was stopped by a keeper. Young pheasants were in the wood, and gins were tilled for their enemies. A tawny owl, perching against the trunk of a larch tree, saw the otters coming up the stream, and its eyes, soft with light as the dark blue sloe is soft with bloom, watched them until they crept into a rocky cleft below a fall, where royal ferns cast their great shadows, and water violets were cooled by dripping mosses. At midnight, the western sky was pale blue and hollow, like a mussel shell on the seashore. The light lingered on the hill line, where trees were dark. Under the summer stars, 100 swifts were screaming as they played away the night, 2 miles above the earth. In fine weather they kept on the wing for many days and nights together, never roosting. Their puny screams were heard by Tarka as he rubbed his neck against the grassy mound of an ant's nest. While he was enjoying the feeling, a loud chattering noise came down from the wood. The otters swung round, 4 heads pointed towards the trees. The bitch ceased to nibble her fur. The other cubs forgot their play with the head of a corncrake. The noise, distinct in the dewfall, was met by other cries as harsh and angry. When the curious otters reached the wood, other noises were mingled with the chattering. Green points of light glinted in the undergrowth about them like moonlight in dewdrops, for many veres or weasels were watching a fight of 2 dogfitches or stoats on the woodland path. Running along the bank of a ditch beside the path, the fitches had met at the mouth of a drain-pipe, out of which strayed a hunger-making smell. The pipe, covered with grass sods, lay beside an oak log felled for a path across the ditch. Both ways had been made by the keeper, one for himself and the other for fitches and veres, whose liking for pipes and covered ways he knew. There were many such ways in the wood, and to make them more attractive, the keeper had placed the flesh and entrails of dead rabbits inside the pipes. Each dogfitch was trying to break the other's neck by a bite behind the ear. They rolled and snapped and scratched with their long claws, their black-tipped tails twitching with rage. Every stoat and weasel which heard them ran to watch the fight on the pathway made by the hobnailed boots of the keeper. Tawny and dwarf owls peered down from the branches of oak trees, while from afar a fox listened and prowled on again. A crow awoke in an ivy-thick holly, muttered "Ah!" and laid its beak against its neck feathers once more. Tarka circled round the stoats with the other cubs, mewing and yickering with excitement, and then he smelt the rabbit flesh inside the drain-pipe. The youngest cub also smelled it. She was quicker than Tarka, and her head and shoulders were inside one end when he ran in at the other. He had bared his teeth to snatch the flesh, when there was a hard snap, a knock of iron on the pipe, a blow on the side of his head, and a loud whimpering and hissing from the cub. Immediately the bitch was by her, running round outside the pipe in her anguish. She scraped at the sods covering the pipe, blowing and gasping anew, when a retriever started to bark. She ran away, whistling the cubs to follow her, but returned to the cry of the cub, which had fallen out of the pipe and was dangling by its rudder. The barking changed to an eager whine when a door of the cottage opened and a man's voice spoke. Sounds came up distinctly from the coombe below. While the otter tore with her teeth at the chain, the spring, and the closed jaws of the gin, Tarka and the other cub ran among the oak saplings, rustling the buff leaves of an old year and breaking the stalks of seeded bluebells, whose caps dropped round black seeds on the earth. When the keeper, hurrying up the field, was within 20 yards of the wood's edge, the otter left the chain she had been breaking her teeth on and ran away. The retriever rushed at the cub to worry it, but the ferocity of the unfamiliar beast made it hesitate. The otter remained standing by her cub, even when the keeper was pushing through the undergrowth. Thinking that a fox or badger was in the gin, he went forward to kill it with a blow of the holly staff he carried. He was peering forward when the retriever, a young animal, ran to him snarling. Something flung itself violently against his legs. The otter weighed 15 pounds, and nearly bit through the leather of his boot at the ankle. He struck at it, but hit only earth. He hurried back to the cottage for his gun, calling the retriever to heel, lest it be injured. The struggles of the cub pulled the iron peg out of the ground, and it was able to drag itself out of the ditch and slowly away among the saplings. The bitch whistled to Tarka and the other cub, who ran out from under the faggot and followed her. The mother ran on with them a little way, then returning to the cub that followed so slowly, with the gin ripping brambles and clanking against stones and roots. Behind the otters came the noise of the keeper crashing through the undergrowth, and the retriever's feet pattering near them. When the keeper came up, the cub was gasping with the weight of the iron it had dragged over 100 yards. He fired at the noise in front of him, and the noise ceased. Into the darkness of the wood he fired the second barrel, and listened. He heard stray pellets rattling in the distance, and the dragging of the gin as the retriever tried to lift it. At dawn, the crow that slept in the ivy-grown holly saw a new corpse hanging among the fitches and vares, which had run into one end of a drain-pipe, but never run out again. The crow said, "Ah!" and flying to the gallows tree, picked out its eyes. When daylight came, the otter and her cubs were far from the wood, having arrived at new water, deep and dark and slow-moving. Time flowed with the sunlight of the still green place. It was peaceful for the otters in the backwater, ring-rippled with the rises of fish, a waving mirror of trees and the sky, of grey doves among green ash sprays, of voles nibbling sweet roots on the banks. The otter heard every wild sound as she lay unsleeping, thinking of her lost one. The cubs breathed softly, but sometimes their nostrils worked and their legs moved, as though they were running. Late at night the bitch returned with the cubs to the wood and whistled for the lost one. She didn't know that it was dead. She knew only her longing for it. Her whistles went far into the still night as she ran with nose to the ground, stopping to whine when her grief was acute. The cock on the apple bough heard her, and crew to the dog in the kennel, who barked to its master. Hearing the bark, the otter took her cubs away, and at the end of the night, when they reached the big river, the lost cub was forgotten. Yellow from ash and elm and willow, buff from oak, rusty brown from the chestnut, scarlet from bramble, the waters bore away the first coloured leaves of the year. Beeches preserved their tawny form in rain and hail, but yielded more and more to the winds. Eels began to pass down to the sea. The eels of the two rivers were devourers of the spawn and fry of salmon and trout, and the otters were devourers of eels. Tarka stood on the shillets of the shallow stream while they twisted and moved past his legs. At first he ate a small portion of each capture near the tail, but when his hunger was gone, he picked them up, bit them, and dropped them again. Hearing the strokes of an otter's rudder, he looked in the direction of the sound and saw a strange cub with a stick in its mouth, travelling under the foamy current. Tarka followed the dim form until he reached a barrier made by an uprooted pollard willow and broken branches lodged in the stream. He climbed on the trunk, shaking water from his ears and eyes, and ran back with jubilant whistles to the sides. There he saw the cub, the stick in its mouth, standing with a grown otter. Tarka yickered and ran back to the water. The grown otter mewed to him, ran after him, licked his face, and purred in his ear. He tissed at her and whistled to his mother, who came to him, but did not drive the stranger or the cub away. The stranger had been the mother of many litters long before Tarka's mother had been born. Her fur was grizzled on pate and shoulders, and her muzzle was grey. Her canine teeth were long and yellow, and she had lost 3 of her incisors. She knew every river and stream that flowed north into the Severn Sea. She had roamed the high, cold moors of 3 counties, and had been hunted by 4 packs of otter-hounds. Her name was Greymuzzle. She played with the otters at the slide, and remained with them when the low clouds became rosy in the east. That day all 5 hovered on Leaning Willow Island, and she curled beside Tarka and washed his fur, treating his as though he were her own cub. Then she washed the other cub, who had a white-tipped rudder. Greymuzzle had met White-tip wandering alone 3 weeks before, and had remained with her ever since. There was friendship and sympathy between the 2 grown otters, for they never yickered or tissed at each other. Some days after the swallows had gone, Tarka heard a strange, soft, curlew-like whistle. The otters ceased their play and listened. The whistle came again, and Tarka's mother answered. The answering whistle was keen and loud. The bitch swam towards it, followed by Greymuzzle and White-tip. The whistle made Tarka cry in rage, "Ik-yang!" And when a dog-cub has cried thus, he is no more a cub, but a dog otter. The night before, the otters had fished in the estuary by the seaweedy hurdles and posts of a silted-up salmon weir, where in former times salmon were left penned by the tide. They had returned to the duck pond across fields and dikes along an otter route, and on their trail an old dog otter had followed. Now he trailed them down to the duck pond, a big, flat-headed, full-thighed dog with great whiskers, more than double the weight of Tarka. He frightened the crier of Ik-young, who crouched tissing with his sister, when the stranger sniffed at her nose and then licked it. This action caused Tarka's mother to behave in a curious manner. Turning fiercely on the cub, she rolled her over, bit her, and chased her under water. Many bubbles were blown up. Tarka dived to see why this strange thing had happened, but the dog turned in a swirl of water to snap at his head. Tarka was so scared that he swam to the bank and crawled out among the dry thistles. Here, while the water ran from his fur, he whistled to his mother. He saw her swimming with her head out of the water, with the strange dog behind, pretending to bite her. She was heedless of her cub's cries, and dived with the dog in play. For hours Tarka ran on the grassy bank of the duck pond, following his mother as she played in the water. Once the dog rose to the surface with a mullet in his mouth, but he didn't trouble to kill it before leaving it to float on its side. Tarka whistled again and again, and at last the big dog left the water and chased the small dog for whistling to his mate. Tarka ran away. He met White-tip and Greymuzzle, and together they returned to the duck pond when the wild fowl flighted over. Then Tarka whistled, and the dog wanted to kill him. Tarka went across the mud and the stones of the pill at his greatest speed. He cried Ik-young several times, but if the dog had returned in answer to the challenge, it's doubtful whether Tarka would have waited to drink the blood of his enemy. Already his mother had forgotten, and perhaps would never again remember that she had loved a cub called Tarka. Tarka was alone, a young male of a ferocious and persecuted tribe. His cubhood was ended, and now indeed did his name fit his life, for he was a wanderer and homeless, with nearly every man and dog against him. He fished the pools and guts of the Branton Pill, eating what he caught among the feathery and aromatic leaves of the sea wormwood plants which grew in the mudded cracks of the sloping stone wall with the sea beet, the scentless sea lavender, and the glasswort. One night a restlessness came over him, and he rowed on the flood tide to the head of the Pill, which was not much wider than the gravel barges made fast to rusty anchors, half hidden in the grass, and to bollards of rotting wood. He had been travelling for an hour, searching the others of the bank for fish, as he had learned in cubhood, when on a sandy scour he found the pleasing scent of otter. He whistled and hurried upstream, following the scent lying wherever the seals had been pressed. Soon he heard a whistle, and a feeling of joy warmed his being. A small otter was waiting for him, sitting on a boulder, licking her coat with her tongue, the white tip of her rudder in the water. As Tarka approached, she looked at him, but she didn't move from the boulder, nor did she cease to lick her neck when he placed his forepads on the stone and looked up into her face. He mewed to her and crawled out of the water to stand on hind legs beside her and touch her nose. He licked her face, while his joy grew to a powerful feeling, so that when she continued to disregard him, he whimpered and struck her with one of his pads. White-tip yickered and bit him in the neck. Then she slid into the water, and with a playful sweep of her rudder, swam away from him. He followed and caught her, and they rolled in play. And to Tarka returned a feeling he had not felt since the early days in the hollow tree, when he was hungry and cold and needing his mother. He mewed like a cub to White-tip, but she ran away. He followed her into a meadow. It was strange play, it was miserable play, it was not play at all, for Tarka was an animal dispirited. He pressed her, but she yickered at him, and snapped at his neck whenever he tried to lick her face. He moved off a few yards and turned to see if she were following him. Her head was turned, she was watching. He was so thrilled that his whistle, a throat sound like the curlew's, was low and flute-like. She answered. He was in love with White-tip, and as in all wild birds and animals, his emotions were as intense as they were quick. He felt neither hunger nor fatigue, and he would have fought for her until he was weak, now that she had whistled to him. Tarka was prancing round her on a bank of gravel when down the stream came a dog-otter with 3 white ticks on his brow, a heavy, slow-moving, coarse-haired otter, who had travelled down from the moor to find just such a mate as the one before him. Tarka cried "Ikyang" and ran at him, but the dog-otter, who weighed 30 pounds, bit him in the neck and shoulder. Tarka ran back, tissing, swinging and swaying his head before he ran forward and attacked. The older dog rolled over him and bit him several times. Tarka was so mauled that he ran away. The dog followed him, but Tarka didn't turn to fight. He was torn about the head and neck, and bitten thrice through the tongue and narrow lower jaw. He stopped at the boulder where White-tip had been sitting when first she had seen him, and listened to the whistles of his enemy. The water sang its stone song in the dark as it flowed its course to the sea. Tarka rowed on with the tide. It took him into the estuary, where the real sea was fretting the sandbanks. He heard a whistle, and answered it gladly. Greymuzzle was fishing in the estuary, and calling to White-tip. The old otter, patient in life after many sorrows and fears, caressed his bitten face and neck, and licked his hurts. They hunted together and slept during the day in a drain in one of the dykes of the marsh. She became dear to Tarka, and gave him fish, as though he were her cub, and in the course of time she took him for her mate. Then came a north wind, which poured like liquid glass from Exmoor, and made all things distinct. It made whips of the dwarf willows, and hissed through clumps of the great sea rushes. The spines of the marram grasses scratched wildly at the rushing air, which passed over the hollows where larks and linnets crouched with puffed feathers. Like a spirit freed by the sun's ruin, and levelling all things before a new creation, the wind drove grains of sand against the legs and ruffled feathers of the little birds, as though it would breathe annihilation upon them, strip their frail bones of skin and flesh, and grind them until they became again that which was before the earth's old travail. Vainly the sharp and hard points of the marram grasses drew their circles on the sand. The icicle spirit was coming, and no terrestrial power could exorcise it. Old Nog, the heron, grew so thin that he looked like a bundle of grey flags stripped by wind and clinging to 2 reeds. His inland fishing ponds were frozen. Most of the streams ran under plates of ice, and the only food he could spear was to be found at low tide in the pools of the Sharshook Ridge, where gravel had been dug. The pans and plains of the burrows were crossed by 1,000 tracks, the prints of larks, finches, wagtails, crows and gulls, the presses of weasels, rabbits and stoats, the pads of badgers and foxes, the triple toes of herons and bitterns, like the veining leaves. Many of the smaller birds were so weak they couldn't fly, and their bodies were eaten by rats and weasels, which were eaten by the larger owls and hawks. Other otters from the 2 rivers came down to the estuary, some of them cubs of 10 to 12 pounds in weight, who had kept together with their mothers. Families of 3 and 4 and one of 5, a bitch and 4 cubs from the boggy moorland hill where the 2 rivers began in the peat, came to the duck pond along the otter path from the saltings, and finding it frozen, went down the pill and out to the coast. The ebb tide moved along the seaweedy perches stuck in the mud to mark the fairway. A mist was rising like steam from the top of the water, which moved slower with its weight of surface slush. The slush became clotted and hardened, and suddenly ceased to move. The star points dulled. Orion was stripped of his flashing, the green tongue of Sirius was mute, the swan lost her lustre, the glare of the bull faded. The little thin cub, on its couch among the reeds, frozen and bent like the legs of dead spiders, greeted Greymuzzle with husky mewing whenever it heard her coming, and would not be comforted by tongue caresses. Frost had stricken its eyes. Greymuzzle prowled all day and all night when she was not warming and suckling her cub, and although she was so hungry she still played with Tarka, sliding head-first down a snowy hillock. They had to travel to the estuary for food, for every incoming tide pulled up its floating floes at the pill mouth, with grinding shrieks and shuddering booms that sounded far over the burrows. At low tide the frost welded them in a high and solid barrier. Both otters had blistered their tongues by licking ice, and to ease their thirst they rasped them against snow on the sea wall in the middle of the day. Swans moved up with the tide, the otters after them. They were thin and weak. For mussels, winkles, and sometimes a sour-green crab were poor nourishment for an otter who, in careless times, had eaten a 3-pound sea trout at a sitting, and been hungry 2 hours afterwards. The swans turned north, borne by the tide racing past Crow Island. The otters drifted nearer, only their wide nostrils above water. When they were 10 yards away from the nearest swan, the nostrils sank, and chains of bubbles rose unseen above them. The swan saw a dark form under the water, but before it could lift out its head, Tarka had bitten onto its neck. Wind from the swan's wings scalloped the water and scattered the spray, and one struck Tarka a blow that made him float slowly away. But Greymuzzle hung to the swan's foot, even when her rudder was nearly out of the water as she was dragged along. The swan trumpeted afar its anger and fear. Across the pull of the tide among the grating ice floes, the otters took the swan, whose flappings were getting feeble as the death-fear grew less. Tarka had bitten the artery in the neck. When the otters rested, the bird lay quiet on the water. It heard the wings of its brethren beating out the flying song of swans, hompa, 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 high and remote in the night. It flapped thrice and died. Tarka and Greymuzzle swam with the swan to the shore, where they bit into the throat and closed their eyes as they drank its hot blood. Later, Greymuzzle returned to the duck pond and her cub. Unsteadily it dragged its little body towards her and opened its mouth to greet her. No sound came from its mouth. Its legs trembled and couldn't carry its head, which hung over the couch of reeds. Its paws were frostbitten, its eye sockets empty. Greymuzzle stared at it before lying down and giving the shelter of her body. She spoke to it and took it in her paws and licked its face, which was her only way of telling her love. The cub tottered away and sought the milk which it could not find. Afterwards it slept, until she left again to seek food in the wide daylight, following the slot of deer across snow. The ice talons set harder in the land. No twitter of finch or linnet was heard on the burrows, for those which remained were dead. Vainly the linnets had sought the seeds locked in the plants of the glasswort. Even crows died of starvation. There were no stars that night, for clouds lowered in the sky. As Greymuzzle walked on the ice upstream, snow began to fall in flakes like the breast feathers of swans. Greymuzzle walked under the bridge, and smelling the ducks, climbed up the bank. As she was walking past the beehives, she heard a sound that made her stop and gasp, the ick-clang of a sprung gin. Tarka was rolling and twisting and jerking the heavy gin and chain off the ground. It held him. He lay still, his heart throbbing, blowing and tissing and slavering. The sight closed Greymuzzle's nostrils so that she breathed through her open mouth. She called to him. The gin clanked, the chain clinked. She ran round him until Tarka's leaps that wrenched the sinews of his leg ceased in weakness, and he sank across the long rusty spring, blowing bubbles of blood out of his nostrils. Greymuzzle rasped the bone of the trapped paw with the sharp stumps of her broken teeth. A rat passed near, brought by the smell of blood. It fled when it saw whose blood was wasting. Greymuzzle's face was torn, but Tarka didn't know that he had bitten her. She bit through the sinews, which were strong and thick, and Tarka was free. He rushed to the river. Greymuzzle remained, remembering her cub. In a nearby farmyard, a dog in its kennel was barking loudly. There was an answering shout in the house that set the animal jumping against its chain. Both Greymuzzle and Tarka knew the sequence of barking dog and the shout of a man in a house. Greymuzzle stayed until the farm door opened, and then she ran away. When the farmer came to the shed with his gun and lantern, he found his gin sprung and 3 toes of a paw lying in a red spatter about it. Seeing dots of blood leading away over the snow, he hurried to the cottage of one of his labourers and knocked on the door. He shouted, "I've got 'em!" as his father had shouted in the church door during a sermon half a century before, calling the men to leave and pursue the tracks of a fox through the snow. The collie dog found the otters for them in a shed where Tarka had crawled for a refuge. Tarka stood back in a corner on a heap of artificial manure sacks, while Greymuzzle ran at the dog, hissing and snapping her broken teeth. The lantern light made of her eyes two tawny orbs of menace. Tarka found a hole in the wall, while Greymuzzle fought the collie. Weakened by starvation, she was not able to fight for long, and as the farmer said afterwards, it was not even necessary to waste a cartridge, when a dung fork could pin her down, and a ferreting bar break her head. They carried the body back to the farm, where the farmer drew a pint of ale for each of his helpers from the barrel in the cellar. While they were drinking, the collie dog began to bark, and as it would not stop after several cries of "Shut that rattle, you!" the farmer went out and gave it a kick in the ribs. He forbore to say how noisy his dog had been afterwards, deeming this a point not in its favour, for how was he, his natural senses dulled by civilization, to have known that an otter had remained all night in the farmyard, waiting for the mate that never came? Tarka was gone, in the mist and rain of the day, to hide among the reeds of the marsh pond, the sere and icicled reeds, which now could sink to their ancestral ooze and sleep, perchance to dream of sun-stored summers, raising the green stems, of wind-shaken anthers dropping gold pollen over June's young maces, of seeds shaped and clasped and taught by the brown autumn mother. The south wind was breaking from the great roots the talons of the icicle spirit, and freeing 10,000 flying seeds in each brown head. Water covered the pond ice, deep enough to sail a feather, and at night every hoof-hole held its star. Bogs and hummocks of the great knee-set were dimmed and occluded. The hill was higher than the clouds. In drifts and hollows of silence the vapour passed, moving with the muffled wind over water-plashes, colourless in reflection. Sometimes a colder waft brought the sound of slow trickling. Here in the fen 5 rivers began, in peat darker than the otter which had followed the Torridge to its source. Tarka climbed up one of the humps of grey club moss and trod in its centre a bed, soft and warm, yet cool for the paw thrust among the long, tight-growing fronds. The moss grew on and over a bush of heather, whose springy stems yielded to his curled body. He had travelled from the estuary, sleeping by day in riverside holts and marches, and feeding at night, remembering nothing because the moor was unfamiliar to his nose and ears and eyes. When his paw ached, he licked it. It had been a happy journey up the river, swollen with snow water, hunting fish and playing with sticks and stones, while mating owls called through the darkness of valleys. The brimming light gladdened Tarka, and he rolled for several minutes, playing with a shiny ball he found in the grass, the old dropping of a wild pony. Afterwards, running down to the water, he found a holt under a rock. It was cold and wet inside, and Tarka always slept dry when he could. He ran out again, liking the sun, and settled on a flat rock in the warming rays. Tarka gave chase to a rabbit during the next night, bolting it from a hillside clitter of rocks in a hollow at the head of a cleave. Near the clitter, a tall stone reared head, shoulders, and body above the rocks embedded there, in the outline of a sea lion, smooth and curved. The rabbit ran as far as a hole in the northwestern base of the stone sea lion, but turned in terror as it smelt the dreaded smell of a fitch or stoat. The rabbit's wits went from it in a thin squealing. Its will to run away was gripped in the base of its spine by a feeling of sickly fascination. Its squeals caused an exciting chattering near it, and almost immediately the fitch had it by the side of the neck and was dragging it into the hole. The fitch, whose name was Swagdagger, was about to kill it when Tarka ran through the opening. Swagdagger loosened his bite to threaten the strange big invader, flicking his black-tipped tail and glaring at Tarka. One kick of the rabbit's hind legs, so powerful for running, would have broken Swagdagger's neck, but it crouched still, its nervous force oozing away. Tarka ran at it. Swagdagger faced him with an angry chaka and was nipped in the shoulder. The fitch ran out through the opening, but turned outside and gibbered in fury. Tarka looked once at the green points that were the fitch's eyes, and went on with his work. Swagdagger went away to climb a granite stone and chaka into the night. The moon was rising, dim in the mist, and the harsh notes echoed about the grey stillness of the granite clitter. Ka-ka-ka-ka, he rattled, throwing his call one way, then another. He was summoning the stoats of Belston Cleave. Tarka had eaten half the rabbit when a strong scent made him look round again. He saw in the low opening several greenish dots that stared and swung about and stared again. He went on eating. Delicate sniffs, sudden rustles and paddings, scratchings, a quick sneeze. He peered for another way out, wanting to be alone. He found a crack and explored it with his nose before beginning to scrape. He sucked in the scent of Fitch, for Swagdagger's mate had her nest of young beyond the crack. She had been hunting a rabbit 300 yards away when Swagdagger had climbed the stone, and as soon as she heard the call she galloped back. Other Fitches had run to the summons of Swagdagger. Sharp-toothed, bloodthirsty and without fear, they ran up and down by the opening, sniffing the delicious scent of fresh-slain rabbit, weaving quick bodies and lifting their small heads to sniff, sniff, sniff. The noises of teeth at work made a furious stir in the assembling tribe. The older dog-fitch yakkered with rage as he wove in and out of the swift and impatient throng. The little angry Fitches in the cranny, beyond the nose of Tarka, heard the cry of their mother and spat at the enemy. All moving things unknown were enemies to the little Fitches. She ran through the Fitches outside in the moonlight and into the cave, jumping in her twisty way for a bite behind the otter's ear. Tarka shook her and tried to kill her, but she ran at him again, and with her ran Swagdagger and all the Fitches who had come to his alarm. Tarka trod on Stoats. He was pricked all over by the teeth of Stoats. He chopped one through the ribs and back, but its biting didn't cease. He chopped it again, trying to hold it by his forepaws, but though broken it was alive and angry and bit through the skin of his throat and hung there as long as his rudder. He pushed through Fitches into the moonlight, and the Fitches followed him, including the 4 young ones, who were excited and eager for play. The pack chased him, throwing their sharp tongues all the rugged way down to the river, into which Tarka jumped with a splash. 3 of them fell in after him, but they didn't like the water, and crawled out, spitting and sneezing, tough and lithe and sinuous as binds of honeysuckle. Unable to find the otter, the dog-Fitches started a fight among themselves. As Swagdagger's mate went up the hill again with her young running behind her, she met a badger who was going to drink in the river. The grey waddler, animate granite, whose head was heavier than her whole body, lumbered out of the way. He sought no unnecessary trouble with Fitches. He had eaten up the rabbit under the sealstone. It was mid-April, swallow time in the West Country. At sunset, as Tarka was crossing a shoal to deep water under an old ash tree, he stopped at the taint of hounds lying on the scour, pitted by their feet. Quietly he turned back to the water to swim sunken in the current, rising only to take in air. Round 2 bends he drifted, then landed and hearkened. An otter path lay across the next bend, and he followed it to the middle of the field, where he hesitated. Strange smells lay in the dew. He walked on, nose to ground, and smelt man, where hobnailed boots had pressed the turf and crushed cigarette ends. He turned back, and would have gone straight to water if he had not heard the cry of a bitch otter at the far end of the path. "Hoo-ee-ick!" he answered, and ran along to find her. Near the middle of the meadow he stopped as though he had trod on a gin. The taint of hounds lay thick with the scent of otter. Grasses were smeared with blood and spittle. His hair rose on his back. He blew through his open mouth, swung his head about as though looking for hounds, and was gone, silent as his low moon shadow. The river flowed darkly to the bend, where it broke shallow over the shillets that scattered the moonlight. Tarka saw a movement at the tail of the shoal where an otter was listening. She ran to him and licked his face. Then she mewed and ran on alone to the riverside. It was White-tip. Tarka followed her. She was draggled and miserable. She caught a trout and called him, but when he reached her she yickered and started to eat it herself. She mewed again and ran into the water, and following her, Tarka returned to the scour opposite the Owlery Holt, where that morning the hounds had plunged and bayed. All the way upstream she had been calling and searching under banks and on the beds of pools. At length she crawled onto the scour with something in her mouth and dropped it on the stones. She licked it from head to tail and mewing again, sank back into the water and returned with another, which she laid with the first found. Perhaps she could not count beyond 2. Perhaps White-tip had not known in her terror how many cubs had dropped in the water when the terrier had driven her out of her holt. The master had seen them sinking in the pool lit by a sun shaft, and hounds were whipped off. They drew on up the river and found the dog-otter, her mate, and killed him 3 hours later as he tried to cross a meadow to the wooded hillside. The old dog and White-tip had wandered together since Tarka had been driven from her in the autumn. Her first litter had been born in January, when the river had frozen, and one day White-tip, returning to the holt, had found them gone. She had called them, seeking everywhere, and in pain, but she had found none to suckle, for a badger, walking on the ice, had dug them out with his long black claws and eaten them. White-tip's grief had been so keen that soon it had grown less, and she had lain with her mate in the bracken of Ferny Hill. And now White-tip was grieving again. For 2 nights as she travelled down the river with Tarka, she would cease hunting and run aimlessly on the banks, whining and searching. During the 3rd night she left him and returned to the ash-tree holt, wherein she had been making ready a couch of reed and grasses. Into the holt she carried a stone, laying it on the couch and licking it, until a sudden cry called her outside again. She traced the cry to a stone on the shallow, and brought it in her mouth to the holt. Soon the couch was filled with wet stones. Tarka travelled on alone. He had gone under the last bridge above the tide, and the sun was rising when he crept out by a mud glidder and curled himself in a bed of green flags. Water ran clear and shallow on its rocky bed below the mud. Swallows flew to and fro across the river channel, winding deeper and broader through the meadows. A dark cloud arose over the crest of the oak wood, and the greenery of young leaves faded. Rain beat on the flags. A million drops in the river leapt to meet the drops fresh risen from the Atlantic. The cloud passed, and again the meadow was hot and bright. Beside the bridge grew an elderberry tree, straight and sturdy as a young oak in a park, one of the few soft-cored elderberry trees in the country of the 2 rivers that had not grown up a cripple of the winds. Its leaves partly hid a motor car, in whose closed body, shut away from the wind and the sun of the English spring, sat some men and women. They were awaiting hounds before moving to the parapet of the bridge, and perhaps, if a kill seemed certain and early, to the meadow over the low wooden fence. Other motor cars stopped on the bridge. The swallows, swooping over the stonework, saw the sunlight browned by the smoke of engines, and dived back again over the grass. The baying of hounds above the bridge became louder, for the otter had swum through the lower stickle and was travelling downstream. The hunted otter was White-tip. She had been chased for nearly 3 hours. Always the cries and tongues and legs had followed her, up the pools and down the pools, from holt to holding, from holding to shallow. "Tally-ho!" She saw faces and waving arms above the bridge, but she didn't turn back. Light-laden drops rolled down the green flags as their points drew down the sky. Tarka lay still, watching. They rustled and broke with soft, sappy noises. White-tip was pressing the bed of flags. Her mouth was open. Tarka, who had been listening for half an hour to the distant cries of men and hounds, stared at the movement. A sudden clamour ran down the river, loud and startling, for Deadlock had found White-tip's deep seals in the mud, where she had crept out of the water. The 2 otters ran through the flags and slid down the mud to the river again. Tarka spread himself in the shallow flow, moving with light touches of claws just above the rocks and stones of the bed. He moved slowly, as an eel moves, as smooth as the water, and with sinuous ease. Sometimes he crept out at the edge of the mud, walked a few yards, and slipped back into the water again. Hounds were crushing the flags around his bed, and throwing their tongues along his line. He swam through a long pool at his fastest pace, putting up his nostrils every 50 yards to breathe, and down again immediately. The tongue of Deadlock spoke across the river, and Tarka trod through brown mud to a black ooze, in which he moved like an eel. The drain led under the tide wall to the glidder above the river. It led into darkness, with light coming through the chinks of a circular wooden trap that kept the tides back from the land. He sniffed at a chink and waited in the ooze. For 2 hours Tarka lay behind the wooden trap. Then he stared up the river. A thin-drawn thread of sound in the air looped to another and another and another, loosed as 4 gossamers floating by in the wind. It was the recall to hounds. The horn-like voice of the huntsman as he talked to the hounds by name came to the otter through the chinks of the sodden elm-wood trap. They trotted on the opposite bank, happy at the huntsman's heels, led home by aged Harper, who had taught them all to mark an otter. Flews to flews with him was Deadlock, and at his stern Blue Maid, old before her time, worn out by swimming. 20 paces behind the pack walked the master with 2 members of the hunt. He was saying that it had been a great day, only lacking a kill to complete it, when old Harper stopped and lifted his muzzle. The air on the water, colder than the land air, was brimming over the sea wall, and Harper had smelled an otter. Deadlock moved into the airstream, threw up his head, whispered, and ran down the grassy bank. 5 men waded the river, and Bitem, the terrier, was taken to the open end of the drain, where Tarka's deep seals in the lower ooze showed like big blackberries crushed in the mud. Bitem was given a pat on his ribs and gently shoved into the dark hole. He crept in, quick and shivering. The ooze sucked at Tarka's webs as he turned away from the light-stripped lid of the drain. He crawled in the ooze, away from the immense din, and saw an enemy coming towards him an instant before he smelled it. Iss, iss, iss! They met and joined and twisted into shapes smoothed by ooze. The terrier got a grip on the otter's rudder and hung on to it. Tarka bit and bit and bit, quick as a striking viper, in cheek, shoulder, flank, nose and ear. Noises of bumping and squelching and snarling and tissing became louder when the trap was lifted and light showed the red and black shaking shapes. The otter's rudder near the opening was seized and pulled by a hand. Another hand gripped the terrier's scruff. The long black smooth shape was lugged out of the drain, the terrier fixed to it. Hounds were leaping and clamouring up at the men. A hand held Bitem's tail stump, another hand squeezed, trying to make him unclench. Tarka writhed and contorted as he hung by his rudder. His back became a bow, suddenly bending up, and his teeth made a row of holes in a hand. The jerk made his rudder slip, and he dropped among the boots, to squirm between legs and away down the glidder. He pulled Bitem with him. Hounds trod on him, snarling and thrusting. Tarka was hidden under their heads, picked up and thrown sideways, then dropped and picked up and shaken. 8 jaws held him at one time in the midst of a deep, sullen growling. He was hid in the plunging of white and brown and black bodies. He bit Deadlock through the flews and again in the nose as he was lifted on other muzzles. Bitem still joined to the base of his rudder. The pack bore him down to the tide where the worry broke up. Heads were lifted again and tongues thrown. Hounds stooped to water. Some swam after Captain, who was cutting the air with his knife-edge voice. But Tarka was gone, and so was Bitem. The terrier came to the surface a minute later, 40 yards away, and swam inshore, spluttering and gasping, the short hairs of the otter's rudder still between his teeth. The tide was flooding fast in midstream. It carried with it sunken branches that sometimes showed a stick and turned under again. Tarka passed them as he swam into a riband of water, returning under the steep and broken rock face that was the river's left bank. The riband moved down again, feeling the roots of oak trees and reclaiming the seaweed hung there since the morning ebb. The otter drifted to a root and rested his paws upon it, breathing through his mouth. 2 pink nicks above his nose welled red immediately. So did his paws. He bled also from rudder, back, neck, flank, and shoulder. While he was among the hounds, he had felt neither fear nor hurt, for the power of all his senses had been in movement to escape. Now his wounds smarted with the salt in the water, and he listened in a still dread for Deadlock's tongue. He lay still for a quarter of an hour. No hound spoke. The water rose and lifted him off the root and carried him away. He drifted through the mouse-hole pit and beyond the oak wood to the deeper winding bed in the meadow, where oarweed hung dry on the lower branches of thorns, with sticks, grasses, sometimes a skeleton of a rabbit or bird. Dead brambles tangled in the thorns were swinging in the water, combing the scum of the tide. Cuckoo flowers grew above the top of the flood, their small, pale, gentle faces rising on tall stems from the dead stumps of trees, some broken and wilting, trodden into the mud and asleep again. That night Tarka whistled in the creek, but heard no answer. White-tip was not there. The flood tide took him 2 miles up the river again to the railway bridge. Tarka walked under the road and climbed into a mill pond where 3 eels died. Travelling up the brook under the mazzard orchards growing on the northern slope of the valley, he reached a great hollow in the hillside, shut in with trees and luminous as the sky. Tarka saw 2 moons, one above trees, the other level and in front of him, for the hollow was a flooded limestone quarry. Hoo-wee-yick! The sweet whistle, like the cry of the golden plover, only softer, echoed from the face of rock across the water. He swam down and could not touch bottom. The sides of the quarry dropped sheer down into the still depths, except at the far end, where was a little bay under a knuckle of land. Fish, big and slow-swimming, lived in the sombre waters of the pit, and Tarka chased one down to mud 40 feet under the surface, where it escaped. Hoo-wee-yick! The sky was growing grey. Tarka could not catch a carp, and he was hungry. He went back to the brook. Hoo-wee-yick! Only his echo replied, and he wandered on. When the bee's feet shake the bells of the heather and the ruddy strings of the sap-stealing dodder are twined about the green spikes of the firs, it's summer-time on the commons. Exmoor is the high country of the winds, which are to the falcons and the hawks, clothed by whortleberry bushes and lichens and firs and moss trees in the goyles, which are to the foxes, the badgers and the red deer, served by rain clouds and drained by rock-littered streams, which are to the otters. The moor knew the sun before it was bright, when it rolled red and ragged through the vapours of creation, not blindingly rayed like one of its own dandelions. The soil of the moor is of its own dead and scanty. The rains return to the lower ground, to the pasture and cornfields of the valleys, which are under the wind and the haunts of men. The moor is to the deer, the badgers, the foxes, the otters, the falcons, and the hawks, pitiless despoilers of rooted and blooded things which man has collected and set apart for himself. So they are killed. A tarn lies under 2 hills, draining water from a tussock-linked tract of bog called the Chains. The tarn is deep and brown and still, reflecting rushes and reeds at its sides, the sedges of the hills, and the sky over them. "Crock, crock, crock," said a raven, cocking an eye at the sky. Tarka lay in the water and watched her picking up frog after frog and pouching them before she jumped off the bank and flew over the eastern hill. That evening Tarka quitted the tarn and journeyed over the Chains to water that hastened in a bright thread out of the bog. It entered a narrow goyle, and the moon was hid by the hill before him. After a mile the water turned north under the hill whose worn grey feet it had broken for its bed. The goyle widened by the hoar oak, whose splintered stump, black as its shadow with the moon behind, glistered with the tracks of slugs. Near the hoar oak stood a sapling, caged from the teeth and horns of deer, a little tree by the grave of its father. And Tarka went down the hoar oak water, which, under ridge and common, shattered the moon into shards and lost them under the trees which grew together in the lower valley. Its voice passed from leaf to leaf, up through the woods where badgers were seeking mice and black slugs, and to the night over the autumn hills. Where 2 waters met to seek the sea together, Tarka walked over the trail of otters, and recognizing the scent of White-tip, he followed up the water the otter had travelled. Near the end of the night, while he was swimming in a pool scooped in the rock below a fall, he saw an otter shape before him. It moved slowly with the sway of waters, its head lolled on a stone. It had been drowned some hours. The whistles of otters playing at the fall during the previous night had been heard by the water owner, who had set a gin under the wash of the fall on a sunken ledge of rock where otters touched after the joyful pounding of the plunge. The otters had come back again. Iron in the water sinks, and however long cubs call her, a bitch otter cannot swim with 3 legs forever. Tarka heard the clink of the chain as the swollen body rolled, and his bubbles, blown of fear, rose behind him. At sunrise he had crossed 2 miles of woods and fields, stubble with lines of sheaves, stacked in 6s and tied in 4, fields of mangel and sweet turnip, where partridge crouched, and pasture given over to sheep, and found other water below Beggar's Roost Hill. Ducks were paddling by a farm as he walked upstream, passing under a bridge by which grew a monkey tree with leaves as sharp as magpies' beaks. Cottages by the waterside and a mill were left behind, and he came to quiet meadows where only robins were singing. He crossed from side to side, looking for a place to hide during the sunlight. 1/2 mile above the mill he found a rock in the left bank of the stream, with a wide opening half under water. Hazels grew on the bank above. Their leaves took on the golden green of spring in the beams of the low autumn sun, as Tarka crept under the rock. He was awakened by the tremendous baying of hounds. He saw feet splashing in the shallow water, a row of noses and many flacking tongues. The entrance was too small for any head to enter. He crouched a yard away against the cold rock. The noise hurt the fine drums of his ear. "Go on, leave it! Go on, leave it! Deadlock! Harper! Go on, leave it!" Then a pole was thrust into the holt and prodded about blindly. It slid out again. Tarka saw boots and hands and the face of a terrier. A voice whispered, "Liu in there, Sammy! Liu in there!" A small, ragged brown animal crept out of the hands. Sammy smelled Tarka, saw him, and began to sidle towards him. "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!" As the otter didn't move, the terrier crept nearer to him, yapping, with head stretched forward. After a minute, Tarka could bear the irritating noises no more. Tissing with open mouth, he moved past the terrier, whose snarly yapping changed to a high-pitched yelping. The men on the opposite bank stood silent and still. No hound spoke, but the reason of the silence was not considered by Tarka, who could not reason such things. The stream being narrow and shallow, the otter was given 4 minutes' law. 4 minutes after Tarka had left, he heard behind him the short and long notes of the horn, and the huntsman crying amidst the tongues of the hounds, "Holla-la-la-la-over! Get on to him! Holla-la-la-la-over!" as the pack returned in full cry to the water, with Deadlock pushing through the pack to tell the way the otter had gone. As Tarka was running over shillets with water scarcely deep enough to cover his rudder, Deadlock saw him, and with stiff stern ran straight at him. Tarka quitted the water. The dead twigs and leaves at the hedge bottom crackled and rustled as he pushed through to the meadow. While he was running over the grass, he could hear the voice of Deadlock raging as the black and white hound struggled through the hazel twigs and brambles and honeysuckle vines. He crossed 50 yards of meadow and ran down onto the tarred road. The surface burned his pads, but he ran on, and even when an immense crimson creature bore down upon him, he didn't go back into the meadow across which hounds were streaming. With a series of shudders, the crimson creature slowed to a standstill, while human figures got out of it and pointed. He ran under the motor coach and came out into brown sunshine, hearing above the shouts of men the clamour of hounds trying to scramble up the high bank and pulling each other down in their eagerness. He ran in the shade of the ditch, among bits of newspaper, banana and orange skins, cigarette ends and crushed chocolate boxes. He ran on for another 200 yards, then climbed the bank, pushed through dusty leaves and grasses and briars that would hold him, and down the sloping meadow to the stream. He splashed into the water and swam until rocks and boulders rose before him. Beggar's Roost Bridge was below. With hounds so near, Tarka was heedless of the men that leaned over the stone parapet watching for him. They shouted, waved hats, and cheered the hounds. There were ducks above the bridge, quacking loudly as they left the stream and waddled to the yard, and when Tarka came to where they had been, he left the water and ran after them. They beat their wings as they tried to fly from him, but he reached the file and scattered them, running through them and disappearing. Nearer and nearer came Deadlock, with Captain and Water Witch leading the pack. Huntsmen, whippers-in and field were left behind, struggling through hedges and over banks. Hounds were bewildered when they reached the yard. They ran with noses to ground in puzzled excitement. All scent was gone. Hounds rolled in the dust or trotted up to the huntsmen, sniffing their pockets for food. Tarka had run through a drain back to the stream, and now he rested in the water that carried him every moment nearer to the murmurous gloom of the glen below. While he was walking past the roots of a willow under the bank, he heard the yapping of the terrier. Sammy had crept through the drain and was looking out at the end, covered with black filth, and eagerly telling his big friends to follow him downstream. As he yapped, Deadlock threw his tongue. The stallion hound was below the drain and had refound the line where Tarka had last touched the shillets. Tarka saw him 10 yards away, and slipping back into the water, swam with all webs down the current, pushing from his nose a ream whose shadow beneath was an arrow of gold pointing down to the sea. Here sunlight was shut out by the oaks, and the roar of the first fall was beating back from the leaves. The current ran faster, narrowing into a race with twirls and hollows marking the sunken rocks. The roar grew louder in a drifting spray. Tarka, with Deadlock still in pursuit, was carried to where a broad sunbeam came down through a break in the foliage and lit the mist above the fall. Tarka went over in the heavy white folds of the torrent, and Deadlock was hurled over after him. They were lost in the churn and pressure of the pool until a small brown head appeared and gazed for its enemy in the broken honeycomb of foam. A black and white body uprolled beside it, and the head of the hound was thrust up as he tried to tread away from the current that would draw him under. Tarka was master of whirlpools. They were his playthings. He rocked in the surge with delight. Then high above he heard the note of the horn. He yielded himself to the water and let it take him away down the gorge. Tarka left Deadlock far behind. The hound was feeble and bruised and breathing harshly, his head battered and his sight dazed, but still following. Tarka had gone under a bridge when Harper splashed into the water. The pack poured through the gap between the end of the parapet and the hillside earth, and their tongues rang under the bridge and down the walls of the houses built on the rock above the river. Between boulders and rocks, crusted with shellfish and shaggy with seaweed, past worm-channeled posts that marked the fairway for fishing boats at high water, the pack hunted the otter. Off each post a gull launched itself, cackling angrily as it looked down at the animals. Tarka reached the sea. He walked slowly into the surge of a wavelet and sank away from the chop of old Harper's jaws just as Deadlock ran through the pack. Hounds swam beyond the lines of waves while people stood at the sea lap and watched the huntsman wading to his waist. It was said that the otter was dead beat and probably floating stiffly in the shallow water. After a few minutes the huntsman shook his head and withdrew the horn from his waistcoat. He filled his lungs and stopped his breath and was tightening his lips for the 4 long notes of the call-off when a brown head with hard eyes was thrust out of the water a yard from Deadlock. Tarka stared into the hound's face and cried, "Ik-yang!" The head sank. Swimming under Deadlock, Tarka bit onto the loose skin of the flues and pulled the hound's head underwater. Deadlock tried to twist round and crush the otter's skull in his jaws, but he struggled vainly. Bubbles blew out of his mouth. Soon he was choking. The hounds did not know what was happening. Deadlock's hind legs kicked the air weakly. The huntsman waded out and pulled him inshore, but Tarka loosened his bite only when he needed new air in his lungs, and then he swam under and gripped Deadlock again. Only when hounds were upon him did Tarka let go. He vanished in a wave. For a week he slept in the disused lime kiln on the greensward above the head and water that lost itself in a ridge of boulders above the tide wash. While he was exploring the fresh water, a storm broke over the moor, and the roaring, coloured spate returned him to the sea. He went westwards under the towering cliffs and waterfalls, in whose ferny sides he liked to rest by day. One night, squatting on a rock and eating a conger, the west wind brought him the scent of white-tip. At dawn he was swimming under the sea feet of the great hangman. and he followed the trail until sunrise was shimmering down the level sea and filling with aerial gold the clouds over the Welsh hills. On a rock below the white-walled tower of Bull Point Lighthouse, whose twin sirens were sending a warning to sailors far out beyond the dreadful rocks, Tarka found again the trail of White-tip, and whistled with joy. At half-tide, Old Nog flew to the 7th hurdle up from the western row, where, unless gorged or in love or disturbed by man, he perched a while during every ebb tide. He stood swaying and sinuating his neck. The grip of his toes was not so strong as it had been in his early tree-top life. While he was trying to stand still before jumping to the rim of the sandbank awash below him, a salmon leapt in the lagoon, gleaming and curved, and fell back with a thwack on the water. Old Nog screamed and fell off the hurdle. He walked along under the hurdles, watching the water. The salmon was many times Old Nog's weight, but it was a fish, and Old Nog was a fisher. Tarka was drifting past the weir when he heard the whistle of White-tip beyond the hurdles. His head and shoulder rose out of the water. He listened. "Hoo-wee-yick!" White-tip answered him. Her cry was like wet fingers drawn over a pane of glass. Tarka's cry was deeper, more rounded and musical. He ran across the strip of wet sand, clambered over the hurdles and down to the lagoon. He touched water, and a ripple spread out from where he had disappeared. His seals in the sand crumpled as they welled water. "Kra-a-ark!" Old Nog croaked his excitement, for the salmon had leapt again, a glimmering curve. The teeth of White-tip clicked at its tail. 3 otter heads bobbed flat as corks of a salmon net. They vanished before a double splash fell. The salmon passed through the cubs, cutting the water. They turned together. Tarka drove between them and slowed to their pace, keeping line. Then White-tip, who was faster than Tarka, overhauled them, and the old otters took the wings. The line swung out and in as each otter swam in zigzag. The eager cubs swam in each other's way. Once more the salmon rushed back against the current, straining through the top hurdles where the water was deeper and safer. Tarka met it, and the thresh of its turning tail beat up splinters of water. The line of otters forced it into the shallow by the lower hurdles. They swam upon it, resting in 2 feet of water, but it escaped past one of the cubs. Salmon, feverish to spawn in the fresh waters of their birth, were running up the fairway, and with the flow came a seal, who tore a single bite from the belly of each fish it caught, and left it to chase others. Tarka brought one of the wounded fish to the rocks, and the otters scratched away scales in their haste to eat its pink flesh. They sliced from the shoulders, dropping pieces to feel the curd squeezed from the corners of their mouths. Tarka and White-tip ate quietly, but the cubs yinnered and snarled. Their faces were silvery with scales when they left the strewn bones. Being clean little beasts, they washed chins and whiskers and ears, and afterwards sought water to drink in the pond behind the seawall cottage. For 2 hours they chased and slew, and when every fish was killed, Tarka and White-tip stole away on the ebb to the sea, leaving the young otters to begin their own life. The next night was quiet and windless, without a murmur of water in the broad pool on which the lights of the village drew out like gold and silver eels. Sound travels far and distinct over placid water, and fishermen, standing in groups on the quay after the closing of the taverns, heard the whistling cries of the young otters a mile away on Crow Island, lost on the shingle where the ringed plovers piped. They were heard for 3 nights, and then the southwest gale smote the place and filled the estuary with great seas. November, December, January, February were past, but otters know only day and night, the sun and the moon. White-tip and Tarka had followed the salmon up the big river, but at the beginning of the new year they had come down again. Drifting with the ebb under Halfpenny Bridge, they crossed the marsh and came to the pool of the 6 herons. March winds brought the grey sea rains to the land, and the river ran swollen, bearing the floods of its brooks and runners. Oak and ash broke their buds and grew green. The buzzards repaired their old nests and laid their eggs. Splash, splatter, the bass were feeding in the weed on the stone piling below the bridge end. Patter-patter, 5 dark shapes moving on the soft wet sand of the pill's mouth. The pattering ceased, and the brook slurred its sand sounds as they slid into the pool. White-tip had brought her 4 cubs from the Twin-ash Holt. Tarka, the eldest cub, was following White-tip, for he liked to do his own hunting. A fish darted around the pier before White-tip and was taken by Tarka. He ate it on the quicksand of the right bank, away from the cubs. The sharp point of the back fin pricked his mouth. Every night for a week the otters came to the pool at low water, until the tides, ebbing later and later, and so into daylight, stopped the fishing. One evening, when the peel rock in the river below Canal Bridge was just awash after a thunderstorm, Tarka and White-tip and the 4 cubs followed a run of peel as far as the weir pool. Tarka swam near Tarka. The cub was lithe and swift as his parent, and sometimes snatched fish from his mouth. They rolled and romped together, clutching rudders and heads and pretending to bite. Their joyful whistles went far down the river, heard by Old Nog as he sailed by in the wasting moonlight. Paler the moon rose, and at dawn White-tip went down with the cubs, and Tarka wandered on alone. But he turned back again, calling her to Canal Bridge to play one last game. Hoo-wee-yick! They played the old bridge game of the West Country otters, which was played before the Romans came. They played around the upper and lower cutwater of the middle pier, while the lesser stars were crowned in the heavenly tide flowing up the eastern sky, and the trees of the hill lane grew dark, and larks were flying with song. Hoo-wee-yick! Tarka followed Tarka out of the river and along the otter path across the bend, heedless of his mother's call. He followed up the river and across another bend, but, scared of the light, returned to water and sought a holt under a sycamore. Tarka went on alone up 3 miles of river to a holt in a weir pool shadowed by trees, where peel were leaping. The sun looked over the hills, the moon was as a feather dropped by the owl flying home, and Tarka slept, while the water flowed, and he dreamed of a journey with Tarka down to a strange sea, where they were never hungry and never hunted. At 10:30 in the morning, a covered motor van stopped at the bridge below the dark pool. From the driver's seat 3 men got down, and at the sound of their footfalls deep notes came from the van. Huntsman and his whipper-in each lifted a rusty pin from the staples in the back of the van and lowered the flap. Immediately hounds fell out and over each other, and to the road, shaking themselves, whimpering, panting with pink tongues flacking. The kennel boy and whip called them by name and flicked gently near the more restless with his whip. Barbrook and Bellman, Boisterous and Chorister, Dewdrop, Sailoress, Coraline and Waterwitch. Armlet, who lay down to sleep, Playboy and Actor, Render and Fencer, Hemlock, the one-eyed, with Blue Maid, Hurricane, Harper and Pitiful, the veterans. Darnell and Grinder, who sat behind Sandboy. Then 2 young hounds of the same litter, Dabster and Dauntless, sons of Dewdrop and Deadlock. And there, Deadlock, his black head scarred with old fights, sat on his haunches, apart and morose, watching for the yellow waistcoat of the master. His right ear showed the mark made by the teeth of Tarka's mother 2 years before, when he had thrust his head into the hollow of the fallen tree. The swung thong of the whip idly flicked near Deadlock. He moved his head slightly and his eyes. From upper and lower teeth the lips were drawn, and looking at the kennel boy's legs, Deadlock growled. The hound hated him. Shortly after 10:30, 11½ couples of hounds and 2 terriers, nearly throttling themselves in eagerness to press forward, were trotting behind the huntsman through the farmyard to the river. They jumped down the bank into the river, leaping across the shallows to the left bank, and working upstream to the occasional toot of the horn. Almost at once, Deadlock whimpered and bounded ahead. Tarka had touched there, on the shillets, 6 hours before. By a briar raking the water, the otter's head was raised. He listened and swam to the bank. Hounds spoke remotely. He knew Deadlock's tongue among them. His scent was washed down by the water, and the hounds followed him. He crept out on the other bank on soft ground littered with dead leaves, which lay under crooked oak trees. He ran swiftly up the slope and entered dark Ham's Wood, listening through the remote sough of the wind in the branches to the faint cries. For nearly 20 minutes he waited, and then the hunting cries swelled in the narrow groves of the wood. Sunlight dazzled him when he ran out of the plantation. Then he saw many men and women before him. "Tally-ho!" Tarka ran round them and dived into the leat. When first he had swum down, the water had brimmed to the meadow, floating the green plants in its slow-gliding current. Now the bank glistened with a sinking watermark, and only the tags of the starwort were waving. Trout darted before him as he swam against the water flowing faster. Tarka became one with the river, finding his course among the slimy stones so that his back was always covered. He lay so still that the trout returned to their stances beside the stone sterlings. "Boys, boys, come on, old fellows! Lew in, old fellows! Come on, all of you!" Tarka swam to the left bank, where he touched and breathed. Then he swam under an arch, turned by the lower sterling, and swam up another arch to a backwater secluded from the main stream by the ridge of shillets made by the cross-leaping waters of the runner-in flood. An ash tree grew over the backwater, but Tarka could find no holding in its roots. He swam past the legs of the swimming hounds and went down again. "Tally-ho!" 1,000 yards from Taddyport Bridge he passed the brook up which he had travelled with his mother on the way to the clay pits. He swam under a railway bridge, below which the river hurried in a course narrow and shaded. An island of elm trees divided the riverbed. The right fork was dry. Hawkweed, ragwort, and St. John's wort, plants of the land, were growing there. Tarka swam to the tail of the island and climbed up the dry bank. He had been lying among the cool and stinking garlic plants of Elm Island for nearly 5 minutes, when he heard gasping and wheezing noises at the top of the island. The 2 terriers, Bitem and Biff, were pulling at their chains, held by the kennel boy. Their tongues hung long and limp after the 2-mile tug from the mills over sun-baked turf, dusty trackway, and hot stones to Elm Island. Just before, while tugging down the path, Bitem had fainted with the heat. A lapping sprawl in the river had refreshed the couple, and now they strove against the collars, pressing into their windpipes. Tarka started up when they were a yard from where he lay. The kennel boy dropped the chain when he saw him. Tarka ran towards the river, but at the sheer edge of the island he saw men on the stones 6 feet below. He ran along the edge, quickening at the shout of the kennel boy, and had almost reached the island's tail when Bitem pinned him in the shoulder. Tissing through his open mouth, Tarka rolled and fought with the terriers. Their teeth clenched. Tarka's moves were low and smooth. He bit Bitem again and again, but the terrier hung on. Biff tried to bite him across the neck, but Tarka writhed away. The 3 rolled and snarled, scratching and snapping, falling apart and returning with instant swiftness. Ears were torn and hair ripped out. Hounds heard them and ran baying under the island cliff to find a way up. The kennel boy tried to stamp on and recover the end of the chain, for he knew that in a worry all 3 might be killed. White terriers and brown otter rolled nearer the edge and fell over. The fall shook off Bitem. Tarka ran under the legs of Dabster, and although Blue Maid snapped at his flank, he got into the water and sank away. "Tally-ho! Tally-ho! Ya-ee! Onto 'em!" A quarter of a mile below Rothen Bridge, the river slows into the lower loop of a great S. It deepens until halfway, when the S is cut by the weir, holding back the waters of the Longbean Pool. Tarka reached the top of the pool. He swam under the outer roots of a sycamore tree, and was climbing in a dim light to a dry upper ledge, when a tongue licked his head, and teeth playfully nipped his ear. 2 pale yellow eyes moved over him. He had come upon the cub, Tarqual. Tarqual, the hairs of his neck raised, was listening at the back of the ledge. He was still as a root. The ground was shaking. "Go in on him, old fellows! Wind him, my lads! Boys, boys! Come on, boys! Get on to him!" Tarqual tissed, moving to and fro in fear of the great noises. Tarka rolled over and swam out of the Holt. Tarqual followed him. He saw Tarka's chain rising bright before him. He turned upstream and was alone. 70 yards from the Holt he rose under the bank to rest and heard the baying of the hounds. He dived again and went on upstream at his greatest speed. At his next vent he knew that the terrible beasts were following him. He swam out of the pool, turned back again, saw their heads in the water from bank to bank, became scared, and left the river. He gained 300 yards before the hounds found his line again. He ran with the sun behind him for 200 yards over grass, then he turned and went through a thorn hedge, climbed the railway embankment, and ran up over Fursbeam Hill, leaving an irregular trail. He ran for 3 miles on land, hiding among the dry spikes of gorse and under branches. Sometimes he mewed in his misery. Hounds ran far ahead of the men and women. Eventually the pack hunted him back to the railway line to where he was crouching low in the thorn hedge. A bird with a loud rasping voice and a beak bent like an iron nail clacked and chattered on a briar rising out of the hedge. It was a bird of property, or red-backed shrike, and Tarka was squatting by its larder of bumblebees, grasshoppers, and young harvest mice impaled on thorns. The mice were dead, but the bees still moved their legs. Tarka ran out of the thorns just before Render's muzzle pushed into his hiding place. But hounds leapt the low hedge and overtook him before he had gone very far on his short, tired legs. Deadlock seized him and shook him and threw him into the air. Tarka sprang up as soon as he fell, snapping and writhing as more jaws bit on his body, crushed his head, cracked his ribs, his paws, and his rudder. Among the brilliant hawkbits, little sunflowers of the meadow, he was picked up and dropped again, trodden on and wrenched and broken, while the screaming cheers and hoops of sportsmen mingled with the growling rumble of hounds at worry. Tarka fought them until he was blinded, and his jaws were smashed. He had gone home before Tarka. Meanwhile Tarka, swimming out of a sycamore holt, had turned to deeper water. Where the river's bend began to straighten again, the right bank lay under oak trees growing on the hill slope to the sky. He made a hidden crossing to listen under cover of flag lilies for more than a minute. The river was quiet. He heard the sound of falling water and swam slowly down after touching under the bank. He passed under the middle arch of the railway bridge and reached the weir slanting across the river. The summer water tumbled down the fish pass, but glided thin as a snail shell over the top end of the concrete sill. The lower end, by the fender at the head of the leat, was dry. Tarka walked along the sill nearly to the end, which was 2 inches above the level of the pool. He stretched his weary back on the warm concrete and sprawled in the sun. He lay basking for more than an hour. Warm and brilliant sun flickers on the shallows below dazed his eyes and made him drowsy. But when a hound, working along the left bank, climbed on the sill by the pass and shook himself, he was instantly alert. Tarka felt neither fear nor rage against the hound. He wanted to be left alone. After several hidden swims from bank to bank and finding no holding where he might lie up and sleep until evening, he walked out by a cattle-trodden grove in the right bank and ran away over land. He followed the otter path across a 1/4 of a mile of meadow and came to the river again by the 3rd oak above Canal Bridge. Tarka drifted under the high, lime-spiky arches of the bridge, and the white owl, roosting on a ledge below the parapet beside the briars of a dog rose growing there with hawkweeds, saw him going downstream. Then the pack came down, and many men, and the owl was driven into wavy flight down the river. It pitched in the tree of Leaning Willow Island as a dull clamour broke out 1/2 a mile up the river. Hounds had marked the otter under a hover and driven him out. Tarka swam until he was forced to vent, which he did at the river verge under the banks or by clumps of yellow flags. Sometimes he crept on the stones, hiding himself under overhanging roots as he sought a refuge, until, dreading the nearness of hounds, he slipped into the river again, covered with a silver skin of air. As he swam, twin streams of bubbles came out of his nostrils, raced over his head and neck, and shook off his back to lie on the surface in a chain, watched by many eyes. Up and down the pool he went, swimming in midstream or near the banks, crossing from side to side, and varying his depth of swimming as he tried to get away from his pursuers. Passing under the legs of hounds, he saw them joined to their broken surface images. From under water he saw men and women pointing with hand and pole as palsied and distorted shapes on the bank. However hard he swam with his 3½ webs, always he heard the hounds, as they spoke to his scent, lying in burst bubble, in seal on muddy scour, on leaf and twig. Once in mid-river, while on his way to a clump of flags, his breath gave out, and he bobbed up to breathe a yard from Deadlock. He stared into the eyes of his old enemy and dived. During 40 seconds he swam a distance of 70 yards to a bed of reeds where he breathed and rested. No one saw him, but they saw the chain of bubbles. Up the river again, past the peel rock, and under the middle arch of the Canal Bridge to the shallow, crossed by a line of men and women standing close together. "Tally-ho!" He turned and reached covering water just before hounds. "Get on to him! Loo on! Wind him, old fellas!" Tarka went down river, but a blurred and brilliant colour band stretched from bank to bank above Leaning Willow Island. He tried to get through, but stockinged leg was pressed to stockinged leg, a fixed barrier behind playing poles. Tarka turned and swam upstream again, leaving hounds behind. For 5 minutes he rested under a thorn bush. Deadlock found him, and on he went to Canal Bridge once more, where he lay in the water, weary after the long chase. The tongues swelled under the bridge. He was nearly picked up by Hurricane, the Irish staghound, but the blunted canine teeth couldn't hold him. The chain became shorter. Tarka was too weary to seek a holding in the banks. He breathed in view of his enemies. 7.5 couples of hounds swam in the pool, their sterns throwing behind them arc lines of drops on the surface. Others splashed in the shallows under the banks. The huntsmen let them work by themselves. During the 6th hour the otter disappeared. The river grew quiet. People not in uniform sat down on the grass. The huntsman was wading slowly upstream, feeling for foothold with pole and keeping an eye on Deadlock. For more than an hour the sun throngs flickered across the placid water. A fallen bough of willow lay in the pool near one bank, and Tarka lay beside it. His rudder held a sunken branch. Only his wide upper nostrils were above water. He never moved. The wading huntsman prodded Peel Rock and the rock above it. Hounds sat on the banks, shivering and watching Deadlock, Render, and Harper working the banks. At the beginning of the 8th hour, a scarlet dragonfly whirred and darted over the willow snag, watched by a girl sitting on the bank. Her father, an old man, lank and humped as a heron, was looking out near her. She watched the dragonfly settle on what looked like a piece of bark beside the snag. She heard a sneeze, and saw the otter's whiskers scratch the water. Glancing round, she realized that she alone had seen the otter. She flushed, and hid her grey eyes with her lashes. Since childhood she had walked the Devon rivers with her father, looking for flowers and the nests of birds, passing some rocks and trees as old friends, seeing a spirit everywhere, gentle in thought to all her eyes beheld. For 2 minutes the maid sat silent, hardly daring to look at the river. The dragonfly flew over the pool, seizing flies and tearing them apart in its horny jaws. Her father watched it as it settled on the snag, rose up, circled, and lit on the water, it seemed. Tarka sneezed again, and the dragonfly flew away. A grunt of satisfaction from the old man, a brown hand and wrist holding aloft a hat, a slow intake of breath, and "Tally-ho!" Tarka dived when the hounds came down, and the chain showed where he had swum. Many saw his dark, sleek form as he walked by the edge of a grassy islet by the 12 trees. The hounds ran to him, and Tarka turned and faced them, squatting on his short hind legs, his paws close against his round and sturdy chest. He bit Render in the nose, making his teeth meet. In an instant he drew back, tissing, and bit Deadlock in the flews. The narrow lower jaw snapped again and again, until the press of hounds hid him from sight. He squirmed away through legs and underbellies, biting and writhing away to the water, and the chain drew out on the surface of the pool, while hounds were still seeking him on the stones where he had sat and faced them. "Loo on then! Over!" Tarka's pace was slow, and his dives were short. In the water by the Peel Rock he lay, glancing at the faces along the banks, across the river and in the river. His small dark eyes showed no feeling. He turned away from the human faces to watch the coming of the hounds. He was calm and fearless and fatigued. When they were his length away, he swung under, showing the middle of his smooth back level with the surface, and swimming past their legs. He saw the huntsman's legs before him, joined to the image of legs, and above the inverted image a flattened and uncertain head and shoulders. Up and down he swam, slower and slower. At the beginning of the 9th hour, an immense fatigue came over him, greater than his fatigue when in the long, hard winter he had lived for over a month on seaweed and shellfish in the estuary. The water seemed to thicken at each thrust of his webs. He ceased to swim and drifted backwards, looking at the huntsman wading nearer. For 10 minutes he rested between dives of only a few yards, and then he rolled from Deadlock's bite and went downstream. He swam with his last strength, for upon him had come the penultimate desire of the hunted otter, the desire that comes when water ceases to be a refuge, the desire to tread again the land tracks of his ancestors. He crawled half up the bank, but turned back at the thudding of many feet. The sideway ply of a pole in a turmoil of water struck him on the head. He pushed past the iron point, but it was brought down on his shoulder to hold him against the shillets. Deadlock bore down on him and pulled him back by the rudder. Amidst the harsh cries of men and women and the heavy tongues of hounds, Tarka was overborne by the pack. The master looked at his watch. 8 hours and 45 minutes from the find in the dark pool. Then the screeching, yarring yell of one of the honorary whips. "Ya-yo! You on him! Ya-yo!" For again Tarka had escaped from the worry, and had merged into the narrow stream of water that hurried to Leaning Willow Island. Below the island the river widened, smoothed with the sky. Tarka swam down slowly, bleeding from many wounds. Sometimes he paddled with 3 legs, sometimes with 1, in the water darkening so strangely before his eyes. Not always did he hear the hounds baying around him. At the beginning of the 10th hour he passed the banks faced with stone to keep the sea from the village, and drifted into deeper water, whereon sticks and froth were floating. Hounds were called off by the horn, for the tide was in flood. But as they were about to leave, Tarka was seen again, moving with the tide, his mouth open. The flow took him near the bank. He kicked feebly and rolled over. "Tally-ho!" Deadlock saw the small brown head and bayed in triumph as he jumped down the bank. He bit the head and lifted the otter high, flung him about, and fell into the water with him. They saw the broken head look up beside Deadlock, heard the cry of "Ik-yang" as Tarka bit into his throat, and then the hound was sinking with the otter into the deep water. Oak leaves, black and rotting in the mud of the unseen bed, arose and swirled and sank again, and the tide slowed still and began to move back, and they waited and watched until the body of Deadlock arose, drowned and heavy, and floated away amidst the froth on the waters. They pulled the body out of the river and carried it to the bank, laying it on the grass and looking down at the dead hound in sad wonder. And while they stood there silently, a great bubble rose out of the depths and broke, and as they watched another bubble shook the surface and broke, and there was a third bubble in the sea-going waters, and nothing more.